welcome back. So it's a joy for me to be here today and to talk about Jonathan Wolff on the occasion of his retirement. We know each other a long time ago, since 2017. We met in a conference in Berlin, on a conference about poverty and political philosophy. And was by a suggestion of Axel Gossery, a friend of us from Belgium, that suggested me to go to there. And I attended as a PhD student, but I had known of Jonathan Wolff through his publications since I was a BE student in Brazil. It was in reading his introduction to political philosophy that I came first aware of his work. I remember being delighted in reading that book, a combination of sharp, clear thinking and an exposition of arguments and issues that was truly accessible. At the time, Brazilian universities had a strong preference for German and French philosophy, and they were focused on ontological and metaphysical questions. Jo Wolff's books showed to me a very different approach to philosophy, which was more specific and thematic way of doing philosophy. And look back, I think this was one of the key moments that helped me to understand what type of philosopher I want to be. We are probably all familiar with his work, but I want to highlight the core features which I believe sets Jo apart from his peers. And that is his commitment to urgent and pressing issues, a way of making philosophy that starts from your case and builds its analysis from that, rather than mainstream approach of applying abstract theories to case. The result is a research that plays well with other fields of social science and makes diagnoses of injustice that are multidimensional and empirical in form. This is perhaps most clear in his book, Disadvantage and Seat of Equals, co-author with Avner Dechalit. Both reflection on real-world society via participatory method, which invite ordinary people to the conversation. I had the privilege of taking part in the later project, conducting interviews in Rio de Janeiro about how people on the ground understand what is to be in an unequal city. And I think it was a space to give some layers of what people in the global south are thinking about these problems. These add new layers of complexity to debate that are not usually present in mainstream theorizing, layers like coloniality, race, and class. And I think this way of working, this way of making philosophy is a reflection of the Jo Wolff I got to know through our work together. A person who is open to new avenues and ways of thinking, curious about what we can learn from others, and who doesn't shy away from the complexities of social and political issues. A brilliant thinker with a very precise analytical mind and with the generosity and empathic disposition that drives a desire to address positive transformation in one's life and in one's society, especially in matters related to local level injustice. So this is connected directly to the panel, and I'm very happy to present two amazing scholars here. So we have here Marta, that is a lecturer in politics at the Department of Political Economics at King's College London. She wrote her PhD on democracy as political agency, governance, and emancipation in megacities, and has since worked on projects on complexities and urban inequality and the impact of cost of living crisis. Her work is focused on democracy, normative challenges of cities and citizen participation from political theory perspective. And her talk are going to be on cities as sites of justice. And next to me is also Anna Barth, and she did her PhD in Oxford under the supervision of Jonathan Wolff, and she's now working as a trainee at the European Investment Bank in Luxembourg, and her talk are going to analyze privatization of public space, a problem affecting many cities around the world, which hasn't received much attention in political philosophy, and which she argues present a normative and political problem, but whose analysis has the potential to inform and improve conceptualization of property rights. So each of them are going to have 25 minutes. And then we open to the Q&A and also to the questions online. And after the section, we are going to have the lunch. So Thank you very much.
You can hear me, yes? No? Not at all? Okay, yes, I think now it's done. Okay, click. Thank you very much, Katerina. That was fantastic introduction and really so many details about my work. That was really great. So thank you very much for the invite. I'm going to talk about cities as site of justice. And because it's obviously a talk in honor of Jo's career, I'm going to very much refer to Jo and Avner's work, City of Equals, on a variety of moments during my talk. But I will start with this picture. The picture is very well known probably from this audience. Why is that? Because obviously this is the cover book of the City of Equals, so you can probably know it if you have read the book, hopefully. If you haven't, I very much recommend you to read the book. The picture is also very, very well known because it has been used in a variety of lectures. I actually use them on my own lectures about inequality and equality in cities. It has been used in a lot of policy proposals and kind of visualizations to demonstrate this vast degree of urban inequality. So those of you can see, you see, it's almost visible. For those of you who cannot really see or are not sure what you are seeing, I'm going to describe it. On the one hand side, you can see really vast luxury. You can see tennis courts, lush greenery, private swimming pools. Something was particularly interesting for me, each in this luxurious apartment, maybe each balcony has their own swimming pool. Maybe it's a jacuzzi, who knows who's there. Like it's really green and blue, really fascinating. And then on the left-hand side of the picture, really a lot of poverty, a lot of really kind of physical and structural degradation, favelas. What's really striking here that they're divided by very, very thin wall. So they're really next to each other. And obviously, for political theorists, this picture raises already some intuitions. It demonstrates how much in real life there is a lot of inequality in cities, how much cities are explicitly inegalitarian sites, that there is something happening, what's wrong. I don't think I have to convince you that there is still ongoing a lot of stuff in terms of inequality. The picture I've showed you was taken actually in 2004. The degree of inequality in cities did not decrease, but actually empirical data demonstrated further increases. This is not fascinating data, so please don't quote me on particularly this data, but this essentially demonstrates the chart over there demonstrates Gini coefficient. It's quite old graph, but it demonstrates that actually income inequality in metropolitan areas is higher on average than surrounding or kind of on the level of the nation states. If we look at the numbers of people who are multidimensionally poor in different continents, those numbers are really, really high. All this information demonstrates that cities are sites of some sort of injustice. There is a lot of inequality happening in the cities, and for a lot of political theorists or political philosophers, this inequality has been something to be bothered about. But of course, cities are not only that. Almost historically, cities have this sort of egalitarian promise. Cities accommodate a variety of real-life relations that are inspiring, that are interesting, that offer some sort of utopian promise of better organization. If we look on everyday streets, maybe some sort of daily interactions with neighbors, maybe some sort of mutual hope during COVID, provide those sort of examples of egalitarian organization of a city. Jo and Avner provide a lot of really nice examples in their book about the sort of egalitarian ideas in a city. For example, football pitches in Brazil open really late, so people who work really late can actually go and engage in friendly game with their fellow citizens. Maybe some sort of public transports that enable in some cities, such as London, people who are not really well off to enjoy city life and go to the other side of the city. Maybe public space, maybe gardens, etc., etc. So cities have both this sort of inequality or kind of explicitly inegalitarian perspective or image, but also they accommodate equality, they also accommodate some sort of promise of better organization of a city. And potentially this sort of tension or this sort of combination of both cities as explicit sphere of inequalities, but also cities as some sort of accommodating promise for better organization of cities, but maybe also elsewhere, it's obviously to some extent a topic of Jo and Avner's book, City of Equals. So I'm not going to introduce the book. Actually, I had the honor of introducing and commenting on the book some time ago. I already commented on a variety of contributions the book made in terms of methodology, work on cities, but also work on justice. But if you didn't have a chance, and I'm not looking at anyone in particular to read the book, I'm going to quickly summarize some certain points. So according to Jo and Avner, the city of equals, city that would be appealing for egalitarians, would be not really a city that provides anyone or everyone in particular in the city, any particular income or any particular opportunities or any particular infrastructure. Rather, it would give to each citizen a secure sense of place. This can be achieved by the author's opinion by 4 values: access to the city services not constituted by the market, equal opportunity to achieve a sense of meaningful life, diversity and social mixing without a monolithic culture, and inclusion without difference and submissiveness. This point I found particularly, the final point I found particularly helpful or important as a migrant in London, this sort of inclusion without necessarily needing to defer or submit myself to, maybe Britishness or Londonness was something what I think is particularly important for the city of equals. But in overall, as Jo and Avner demonstrate or argue, in a city of equals, you are made that you made to feel that you matter, at most essentially that you belong. So during this talk, I'm going to use this book and use also broader Jo's work on cities in order to some extent, become an explorer and kind of map the existing normative interest in a cities as opposed to interest in nation-state, as opposed to the global arena, investigating what really can happen or what really does it tell us about the field of political theory or political philosophy if we consider cities as a site of justice. And I want to emphasize this is very much interpretative experience, so I don't really assign, I'm not sure, I didn't really ask the authors, I didn't really ask Jo or Avner whether they really think so. That's how I interpret they work. And in doing so, I'm going to draw on my recent work with James Hickson from University of Liverpool on local political theory. So in this work, we essentially started from certain observation that a lot of political theory currently a kind of contemporary political theory, contemporary political philosophy, at least since the establishment of the nation-state, has been very much focused on the nation-state with some sort of considerably recent ongoings and interest in global political theory. But despite really raising and increasing interest in issues of streets, especially in terms of urban debates in political theory, there isn't really anything that would accompany it, which would be kind of comparative to local or interest in local. So we essentially try to establish a growing or kind of looking at this ongoing literature interested in issues of locality or cities, we develop something what we call local political theory. In this paper, we argue that the local, so the cities, either cities in abstract way or particular cities like London or Rio, can actually play 3 roles in political theory. They can be an object of analysis, they can be object of normative concern, and they can be also an object of application. I'm going to describe all those roles in a bit, in very brief words in a second, but I just want to highlight that they are analytically distinct, but they are not mutually exclusive. So political theories very often, for example, use one of those roles, but don't commit themselves to the others, and that's perfectly fine, and that's perfectly something what could be done, and indeed it is done. So let's start from using the cities or local as an object of analysis. I think it's quite an uncontroversial point. This is simply when political theories use life in cities as some sort of starting point for constructing of more broadly applicable theory of justice or egalitarian relations, or if they are not concerned with justice, democracy, or I don't know, some other kind of political theory. But for the perspective of this talk, I'm interested in issues of justice and equality or egalitarian relations. I think it's quite uncontroversial point because majority of human population live in cities. Majority of political philosophers who have training and possibility to actually engage in political philosophy would definitely work and live in the cities simply because a lot of majority of universities are located in cities. So obviously philosophers, political theorists, they use their daily observation, they live in society and they use their daily observation as some sort of input to political theorizing. So I don't think it's necessarily controversial. Obviously, the life of cities can be very explicit, a source and starting point for construction of theory. In Jo's and Avner's work, it was 182 face-to-face interviews. I mean, I did some interviews in my work, and 182 is an impressive amount. In as diverse cities as Amsterdam, Berlin, Hamburg, Jerusalem, London, New York, Oxford, Rio de Janeiro, and Tel Aviv, which is fascinating. Obviously, the sort of reference of a city as a starting point for construction of theory could be much more abstract. So, for example, very famously, Iris Maron-Young referred to undisclosed American city, probably the city she was living in, to kind of construct a theory of ideal of a city life in which people can remain in these clusters of belonging, they don't feel the force to integrate, but nonetheless they can have some sort of attraction, erotic attraction as she calls, by engaging in the difference. So, obviously, for both me and my co-author, we argue that this sort of treating the city as an object of analysis is great for politica theory because it contributes to richness and kind of refinement and kind of, we can finally see a lot of details, small details within the politica theory. It provides rich ground for development and refinement of theories, provide new and complementary perspective to maybe state-centric or global-centric perspective, but also potentially opens up for some sort of new collaboration with urban scholars, regional scholars, policymakers, etc. So overall, we think it's great. The second way in which politica theorists can engage with cities as sites of justice would be to treat them as object of normative concern. Within politica theory, thinking about object of normative concern usually would mean that there is some sort of entity that we treat as some sort of ultimate end and kind of ultimate unit of normative that we should be concerned about when constructing theories. Usually it will be a human, sometimes could be a state, sometimes could be a group. Obviously, city, it's maybe unusual, kind of controversial candidate for being an object of normative concern. We argued in the paper that politica theorists would treat a city as object of normative concern if they consider whether urban actors, institutions, experiences, etc., carry specific normative value or normative obligations. Another way, politica theorists who treat cities as object of normative concern would consider cities as would assign to city or city actors some sort of duties, some sort of responsibilities, and would assume that it's possible, it's feasible, and it's reliable as well, or correct in terms of politica theory, to assess those urban actors from the perspective how they fulfill those duties. And obviously, I think this is actually the most controversial way of engaging with urban life or political institutions in cities, simply because the city, almost famously, it's not sovereign. The state is sovereign, the state has sovereign authority, but very often city authorities and city actors would be under the state, would kind of not be able to perform all the duties, or would not be able to perform all the actions in a way that will be sovereign and would be entirely their responsibility. Furthermore, what's interesting, cities are very strongly influenced by, for example, international actors such as international corporations, much more comparing to much higher degree than the nation states. They will be affected by international finance institutions because they rely on funding. Cities are famously underfunded. So actually this kind of problematizes slightly this view, or this sort of role of cities in politica theory. But on the other hand, if you're interested in cities at all, you know that there's so much more independent action happening at cities. There's a whole movement of sanctuary cities in a variety of ways. There are mayors who are becoming very vocal, very political, who realize their own agenda. There are also cities who engage in vertical networks, overcoming the nation state. So they're kind of grasping out on some sort of levels of sovereignty, and they are becoming sovereign actors. In terms of the treatment of city as object of normative concern, Jo and Avner's work obviously also treat the city as object of normative concern. Very early in the book, they investigate whether it's possible or whether it would be good idea to consider issues of justice in a city through the perspective of the nation state, simply to treat a city as a mini-state, and they argue against that. They argue that actually city is very different because of the rationale, the character of their political relations, character of their power, and also lack of ability to raise taxes. Another interesting book or another interesting work that would draw and treat some sort of city as, actually municipality, not a city, as object of normative concern would be a recent book of Badano and Nati on political liberalism, in which they treat municipal powers as agents able to contain or kind of having responsibilities to act against illiberal forces happening in the state. So obviously, again, me and my co-author, we think that treating a city as object of normative concern is great for political theory, simply because it provides opportunities for analyzing duties, responsibilities of diverse actors. You know, if there's a certain number of states, there are many more cities all over the world, so there's much more work for political theorists. It provides targeted and nuanced tools for normative guidance of issues arising locally, but also, I think, which is this kind of treatment of cities as object of normative concern enables to treat cities as site of justice or as injustice as well. And I think it's, at first level, it could be considered a bit trivial to think, like, obviously there is some sort of justice in the cities, and obviously there will be some sort of injustice. But thinking about cities as sites of justice, vulnerable on their own, enables political theorists to think, engage in some sort of broader, potentially comparative analysis, thinking about whether it's possible to seek coherence across different levels, maybe between different regional levels, national levels, and local levels, or maybe even coherence across different sites, different local sites, or maybe actually there is some sort of incoherence and seeking such sort of universal coherence is never possible. So essentially it opens up new ways for investigation. The final way in which political theorists can engage with the city would be to treat it as an object of application. Here I understood this object of application very broadly as when political theorists apply normative insights to help interpret, inform real-life urban politics. And obviously Jo's work has been very significant in terms of developing this broadly established work within political theory of engaged or applied political theory, in which political theorists engage with real-life world and aim to have some sort of influence. This other type of work over here, beyond obviously Jo's and Avner's work, and Jo and Avner's work City of Equals has very explicit applied angle, despite the fact that the work or the book doesn't really provide very concrete recommendations, kind of pass it on to the citizens, to ask citizens to decide what are really the trade-offs between the values, the applied angle, and kind of hope that you can actually, the book will make the cities much more egalitarian spaces. It's really, really evident there. Other examples of treatment of city as an object of application could be Herzog and Rural Urban Justice, in which she applies or uses relational egalitarian ideas to assess how supply of different infrastructure and educational opportunities between rural and city spaces can be justified, whether it can be justified at all, and actually that it cannot. So treatment of the city as an object of application for political theorists, again, create a lot of opportunities, provide opportunities for assessment and evaluation of normative quality of political perspectives, engage, or kind of provides opportunities for potentially much more engaged real-life politics, political philosophy, maybe even grounded approaches, provides also opportunities to engage or provide some sort of real-life impact for those of you who apply for funding. Impact is very important. For those of you who don't, you are lucky in that. You don't have to think about impact. But in kind of blunt way, I think treating a city as an object of application invites political theorists to kind of leave this sort of metaphorical armchair, go back to the ground, get their heads dirty, sow the seeds of the theory and see how they blossom, which obviously, as you can see from my interpretation, I found as a very, very optimistic way of dealing with that. So my final kind of two words to say, like both me and my co-author, both me and James, we think that treatment as a cities as objects of either of application, object of analysis, of normative concern, essentially contributes to broader political theory. It provides more nuanced, comprehensive view of multidimensional and complex words, but also provides some sort of challenge to the status and universalistic understanding of politics. And the final thing thing I wanted to say is just simply because it's a retirement way. I wanted to say that as a person who's been working on cities and had to argue very, very often about the value of dealing in cities, that cities also belong to the politics and Poet Cafe, I want to say thank you. Thank you for craving the path for both engaged Poet Cafe more applied, but also for treatment of the cities as really important aspects and object of theorizing. So thank you very much.
Do I go now or do I go? Thank you. Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for introducing me, and I'm really happy to be here. So one of the best things about having Jo as a supervisor, I'm sure other D4 students know this, is the walking supervision. So we were lucky also during lockdown, and I think we kept going even afterwards. So we got to experience the city during work hours. Okay, so I'm going to put a timer on my phone so that I don't stop watching. Great. So just to sort of motivate the topic, maybe you recognize this. This is in King's Cross. On the left, I'm sure many of you recognize this just here in Oxford. This is Paternoster Square in London, where the London Stock Exchange is. And here, maybe you recognize some of these as well. So this is Battersea Power Station. You see the City of London over there. And all of these places look sort of like public spaces. And they are public spaces, but they are all private property. So they are owned not by the City of London or by some sort of hybrid like the Crown, actually, but by sort of real estate developments, firms, and other sort of big conglomerates. And there's a bit of a sense that people are a bit creeped out. Okay, so this is all from one newspaper, so you can see where this is going. But, you know, Corbyn joins calls, creep, insidious creep of pseudo-public space. Stockholm says no. You can see, there's this sort of narrative of attack and danger. There could be none left. People are creeped out by the fact that some of these companies, some of these owners use facial recognition technology. But it's not that simple, because if you read the comments, you know, they are nice places to be with your children and with your grandparents. There's someone who picks up the rubbish every day. There are no drunk people. There's no sort of loitering youth. Here at the bottom, you can see developers have brought them into attractive, clean, and safe public use. It's a scandal. Okay, so this is sort of my starting point. It seemed to be sort of an interesting thing to look at. Yeah. Okay, so let me quickly define so I'm going to call them POPs. It's a privately owned public space. And it's a little bit difficult to define what they actually are, but I will just focus on sort of quasi-public spaces, so things like a plaza, park, squares, embankments, open-air spaces that are owned by private companies. And I'm going to exclude other places like libraries, malls, that sometimes come up in discussion, and also, maybe very importantly, virtual spaces. It's not that simple, so I assume this neat dichotomy between privately owned and publicly owned public spaces. But at the bottom, you can see, you know, the Royal Parks of London, they're owned by the Crown. Lots of public spaces are also owned by charities and trusts. It's a little bit more complicated. And the important thing to realize is that just because it's publicly owned doesn't mean it's, you know, it has public character. So if you think about the White House or 10 Downing Street, you can't walk in there even though they are publicly owned. There's a little bit of a nuance about privatization and publicization, where publicization is the development of previously unused private land, which is now opened up to the public. It doesn't really matter too much, I think, for right now, but it's just useful to keep in mind. Okay. I guess what I want to sort of suggest in the next 15 minutes is sort of two very modest points. I don't want to end up at a place where I say POPs are bad, but maybe what I want to offer is sort of two reasons to be a bit skeptical of privatization or of POPs. But there's a lot of reliance on empirical, somewhat contingent facts. This is a very sort of, I want to be modest in my goals here. But what I want to suggest is that insofar, so this is just a preview, insofar as privatization sort of impedes the facilitation of certain values, we have a little bit of a reason to be critical. And same, and this is a little bit more explorative, insofar as privatization limits the ability of the state to express certain values. In some cases, we also have reason to be critical of privatizing the public space. And at the same time, I think there's a really important and interesting objection that maybe I will talk about as well. Okay. So why we value the public space, you see how this links in with a lot of Jo's work on cities. I think it's quite uncontroversial, but why do we need the public space? I mean, these are not the only reasons we value the public space, but three important ones is obviously as a site for protest. A lot of political theories will obviously value protest, and protest needs space. The public space is not the only site where you can protest, but at the very least it's very good. So of course you can go on strike, or you can just hang a poster in your window. But going to the public space is just to a park is visual, it's cheap, there's not a lot of entry requirements. Then relational egalitarians are quite explicit in valuing the public space as a site for connection. So Elizabeth Anderson writes, the users of a park together create a lively scene of diverse people and purposes with many occasions for spontaneous interactions that can build a spirit of trust and civility amongst users. So the public space is envisioned as a site where people can interact as equals and experience a commonality, which in turn is important for the relational egalitarian project. And now for those of you who think this is delulu, I mean, how often do you really connect with, you go to a public, how often do you really connect with sort of, there's parents with children, but there's also people who are trying to convince you to convert to their religion or to become vegan, or how often do you really do that? Well, there's something for you as well. So theorists sort of so yeah, I've got this quote here by Young, but in the tradition in general of a communicative democracy, it goes beyond deliberation amongst gentlemen who already share basic understanding. So the idea is that it's necessary for democracy that people recognize each other as having the same political rights, even if and especially if they are from different groups. And public spaces make this difference obvious. So you don't have to change your conviction, but knowing that people are different is valuable, and you have that knowledge as you go through life as background knowledge, and as you go through life and make your decisions and also your political decisions. Okay, so we think, it's fairly straightforward insofar as the public space, the privatization of the public space impedes the development of these values. We have reason to be critical of it. Now, this is really an empirical question. So what actually happens when you privatize the public space? I think, so a few things. Privatization is important to notice that it's happening at quite rapid speed. Almost half of all new urban space in London is privately owned. And it may look quite similar to publicly owned public space, but it's actually very heavily surveilled. So you have private security guards. Next time you go, you really notice these things. There's private security guards. There's cameras, which may use all kinds of technology that's not permitted on publicly owned public space. And there's a de facto exclusion of essentially really very many groups of people. And so anyone that's really a non-consumer. So it makes sense for them. They don't want people who just hang out, young people loitering, of course, homeless people. Leisure activities like just sleeping, even taking pictures, all of these things are forbidden. I mean, it sounds dystopian, but this is what's happening to certain people. Okay. The law is a little bit complicated, but here it's important to notice that, so this is a legal theorist, she writes, subject to equality rules, developers can lawfully exclude anyone from their land without a license. Little has changed since, in 300 years. every invasion of private property, be it ever so minute, is a trespass. No man can set his foot upon my ground without a license. So it is the case that a POP's owner can exclude anyone at will from their land. So from these spaces that you saw at the beginning, you can be kicked out at will. So this is constrained somewhat. You can see subject to equality rules. So it's constrained by equalities legislation, which means you can't be kicked out for being a member of a certain racial group, for example. But short of that, you can see over some very illustrated stock photos, you can be excluded for taking pictures, taking a nap, loitering. Of course, people who are homeless or buskers, also anyone protesting. So it's really it's essential to note the legal powers that underlie the POP's owner's powers of exclusion. In America, it's slightly different, but still it's basically the same picture. In contrast, these sorts of activities are all explicitly permitted on publicly owned public land, including freedom of speech and protest. The other thing maybe that's a little bit important is that the rule-making process is also a lot more opaque on POPs. So not only are the rules often unknown, you won't necessarily find them on a sign, but they're also unknowable. So even if you so you have journalists messaging, requesting the disclosure of these rules from the owners, and they are not actually required to disclose those rules to you. Okay, so this is just writing it down. This is, I think, the first sort of reason we may have to be a bit critical of privatization. So we have reason to value X. X is just a placeholder for what we said earlier, connection, disruption, and protest. And insofar privatization limits the development of these values, we have reason to be critical. So I think it's very obvious with protest, but also if you think about the homogenization of the public space that results from some of these practices, I think you can say it makes sense to me that also opportunities to connect and be disrupted by each other decrease quite manually as well. Okay. So you may say, why am I so focused on ownership as opposed to management? So you've got some people saying, morally, it really matters very little who owns and manages public spaces. Instead, what matters is how public they are and how free access and premises use are guaranteed over time. So as an example, this is Zuccotti Park in New York, where the Occupy movement was for a very long time. Why? Because it was under 24-hour access rules, which is a lot more generous than the other public parks that exist in New York. And at the starting point, of course, it's true that we said public ownership doesn't make a space public and vice versa. So I think this objection, the objection is, why am I focusing on ownership? Just legislate a privately owned public space such that it is identical in an experiential way to a publicly owned public space. So I think it raises two interesting questions. Is that possible? So can ownership and governance come apart? And then the second interesting question, and I don't offer any answer to that, is should they come apart? So should we disentangle governance practices from the way we think about ownership? I've sort of given a few sort of, I guess my take in red, and I just want to spend the next sort of 10 minutes just talking about those two before I wrap up. Okay, so I actually think there are good reasons to think that ownership is tightly linked to governance. I think there are three reasons. First of all, contingently right now, in the law, management tracks ownership, so I'll talk about that. And then there's two contingent reasons, non-contingent reasons. One of them is that a lot of legal theorists tend to think that property rights entails a certain exclusion practice. And also, and this is a little bit explorative, is that ownership matters because upon privatization, I think the expressive content of some public spaces is lost. Okay, so the first reason why I think it's difficult to disentangle ownership from governance is that it's actually very difficult to enforce certain management practices after sale. So In the UK, you've got this: the burden of a positive covenant cannot bind successors entitled to freehold land. What does this mean? I buy a house from somebody, and that somebody had an agreement with their neighbor to share the cost of their mutual fence maintenance. That's a positive covenant, I must do this. But actually that cannot be passed on if you sell that house now to me. So you can see how this ties to the public space. The public owner cannot say, oh, you must allow people to protest, to the subsequent owner. That doesn't bind anymore. The other reason why I think it's difficult to disentangle governance from ownership is that a lot of people think that the right to exclude is really the basic definition of what it means to have a property right in something. So there's the strong understanding that property and the right to exclude are conceptually congruent and not just as a matter of current legal practice. And some people think that, yes, we have other legislation, other rights, but they only constrain property rights. But which are then constituted by the right to exclude. So the very definition of private ownership entails a certain governance practice. So that's the other reason I would push back on the objection that we saw. And now the third one, it's a little bit explorative. It ties in also with a lot of the work that, for example, Shai is doing or has done. So, okay, I think public spaces also are often a vehicle for the state to express certain beliefs or attitudes. But if that space is privatized, it's much harder for it to be a vehicle for expressing those values. So this links to some of the work on inherently public goods, but I want to have a sort of expressivist, relational, egalitarian angle to it. So here you see, okay, this is on the left, it's Black Lives Matter Plaza in DC, or what used to be Black Lives Matter Plaza in DC, when they just dismantled it last year. So you can see the dismantling going on on the left in the background. And then on the right, this is in Vancouver. Okay, so to start with, I think under relational equality, the state is required to express equal concern and respect for the people that it has power over. That's my starting point, yeah. Now, the expressive content of collective action is a matter of public and shared meanings, so it arises from our shared history, from our culture, from our practices. But the takeaway of this is that an expressivist understanding of relational justice is that policies can be appropriately interpreted as expressing official state beliefs and attitudes. I think it's quite. It's very obvious if we think of policies that we think express the hatred of the government, for example, towards certain groups. There's lots of examples in history, but I think public spaces, apart from being a place for leisure, connection, disruption, protest, are also vehicles for the state to express, or can be, that it has respect for its citizens. So this is explicit on the right. If you look through the Downtown Public Space Development Strategy for the city of Vancouver, it says the guiding value for this development is respect for Indigenous culture. Public space should recognize and reflect the history of the land on which the city was built by providing ways to decolonize current practices. The strategy is framed under the goal of reconciliation, and as part of that, they've renamed the Queen Elizabeth Theatre Plaza and given it an Indigenous name, which I believe is pronounced Hoosh Clanak. Okay. So I think this is clear expressive content. So the state or the city wants to signal its respect and concern for Indigenous communities and its understanding of history, as well as communicate that it is taking responsibilities for past wrongs. So I think the public space here is a vehicle for the state to express certain beliefs and attitudes. And now the question is whether this is possible or as convincing if the public space is privatized. Now, I think, given the social meaning of certain acts, this is quite challenging. So the starting point is sort of examples given by, so this is from Deborah Satz, buying a gift for a loved one or committing an honor killing, okay? So both of these change their nature if you pay someone else to do them. Yeah, they don't count anymore. And now the question is, So the key is the meaning of the social meaning of certain acts as agent relative, so they depend on who's carrying them out. So we can ask, and this is a test, okay, can pop still be a vehicle for the state to express certain beliefs or attitudes? If, so for example, we can take this. Imagine that upon payment or request by the state, some large company in Vancouver visibly renamed the piece of land in front of their office to a name that reflects the area's Indigenous heritage. And would this act have the same expressive content as the city renaming one of its own spaces? So this is the fake newspaper headline. You can see what you think. And so the question is, does this have the same expressive content for you? So I don't think so. When I floated this to Jo, he seemed to be sympathetic, but my other supervisor didn't see it. So this really is a test. I think especially in the case of expressing remorse or apology, we seem to be quite reluctant to accept that the expressive content of an act can be preserved upon payment, but it varies. You know, this is a very specific taste. You see what you think. So I've slightly cheated here. But so this is the second reason that I think we may have reason to be critical of privatization, insofar as the state sets out to express these beliefs and values, and this is not always the case, but insofar as the state sets out to express these things, by providing public spaces, we have reason to oppose privatization. Okay, so now I'm just going to wrap up what I said, and then maybe leave us with some very tentative food for thought, which is what Jo encouraged. I've argued that with regards to the public space, ownership actually does matter. It's difficult to disentangle. This is because of current legal practices and because of deep beliefs that ownership and governance are conceptually linked. And then also in some cases, ownership matters because upon privatization, the expressive content of some public spaces is lost. Now, the final thing is that I sort of floated that the second interesting question that the objection raised was, should ownership and control come apart? And this is really a question of what is the correct conception of property rights. What do you think should a property right entail? And I think and this is kind of a lesson that I took from 6 years of being supervised by Jo through my master's and my PhD, is that concepts property rights don't just fall from the sky. So it's a little bit of we can think political theory informs what we regard as the appropriate ownership model. So we have this idea that actually this sort of lends tentative support to the idea that property rights are a social relationship that we constantly renegotiate, and that we constantly renegotiate. So thank you so much for listening. That's it.
So we had 10 minutes.
20.
20, okay. 20, and so should I collect all the questions? And Cecile first.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I have a question for Anna. Two questions, if I'm allowed. Although both have to do with the contingent nature or not of our skepticism, with respect to privatization. So the first prong of my question is about the right to exclude as constitutive of what it means to own, something. And here, I wasn't entirely clear as to why that concern could not be met. The concerns that you've raised could not be met by more extensive, regulation. As you correctly point out, in England, equality legislation, offers some protection, against, exclusions. Why can't we extend the reach of those protections by, for example, making it very clear that in law, private owners of, for example, parks, will not be allowed to, for example, kick out, groups of teenagers, who congregate there. So that's my first question. The second question is about the expressive, dimension, of the argument. I'm very, very, very sympathetic to what you are trying to say, but here too, I'd like to know whether, on your view, the skepticism that we ought to nurture, vis-à-vis privatization is contingent on the facts of the case. So imagine that we have a political community which is deeply homophobic. The state claiming to act on behalf and at the behest of the majority of its deeply homophobic citizens makes it unlawful for gay couples to engage in public displays of affection in publicly owned spaces. That political community at the same time does not want to annoy big businesses, and it so happens that there is a bunch of big businesses who, for good or less good, reasons, decide that in the spaces which they privately own, it's entirely fine, for gay couples to engage, in public, displays of affection. Now, it seems to me that in this particular case, the reason that you identify as to why we ought to be skeptical of privatization would not be as powerful, as it is, in the cases that you gave us. But no, thank you. I thought that was very interesting. Thank you.
So do you prefer to collect all the questions or reply each one?
Whatever you like. You're the moderator.
Take him as much as you can. So Laura, Valentin.
I feel bad that I come so early on. I had a question similar to Cecile's, then I'll switch to a different one. And that is how sort of strongly opposed to POPs you are, in the following sense. Is the idea that there should be enough publicly owned space in a city, but it's also okay if a few POPs pop up here and there, or there is something almost intrinsically wrong about this hybrid thing that POPs is. So we should try actually not to have it in the first place. Yeah.
So there's, I don't know your name.
Maybe it's good for me too, because
Right. Okay. I agree with you that ownership matters. In more benign times, I did some work with Hermes Real Estate to help develop and manage King's Cross, and they insisted that they were grounded in public values, that they were going to be using private means for public benefit. And I know that's been trotted out a lot by these kinds of developers and in other arenas. But it does make me think whether we could actually find hybrid forms of ownership similar to the kinds of mutual ownership that we see in employee-owned businesses and cooperatives, and that this might help both of your presentations, thinking about equality and the expressive content of the city. I mean, Hermes Real Estate did very briefly adopt the idea of the meaningful city because they recognise the need to enable expressive content within the areas that they were looking after. But that brings to the fore all kinds of questions about power and equality and the ability of not only people within their little bit of development, but also in surrounding areas to actually shape the meaning of the city and how it marshals its resources for public goods.
Do you want to take one more question?
I don't know, my short-term memory is not amazing. So, yeah. Maybe I go with the second question first. I think definitely it's. So your question was, if I understand it, is there a difference between being a few POPs and only having pops. And yes, of course, I think there's a big difference. So the things that I said about connection and disruption, for of course, if there's plenty of opportunity to protest, connect, and disrupt each other, and there's a few pops, that probably doesn't make too much difference on your ability to connect with others. It's a little bit of a sliding scale. So if there are only a few places and you have to travel very far, then do you really have the same opportunity to protest, for example? So definitely it's a little bit of a tipping point theory. There's a tipping point to be made, probably. And then, yeah, to Cecile's question. I think your first question, the way I understood it, was saying, why not just constrain property rights more and more? I think maybe there's certain things to be done, so you can explicitly allow all of these activities that I said, but I think conceptually, a lot of people think that is the power of exclusion inherent in the property right, and you exclude it more from the outside? Yes, you can legislate every single little thing, and maybe practically that makes a difference. But I think there's a lot of pushback also in the courts that there's really very high burdens that need to be met. So when it comes to equalities legislation, I think there's very fundamental rights that we think have to be preserved as well, so they're very much in conflict with the power to exclude. I'm not so sure that we have the same strong commitment to rights like taking pictures, taking a nap, even young people loitering. Do we have the same sort of commitment to that being a right that needs to be as well preserved? I'm not sure. I think there's a potential sort of pushback here. I really like what you said about, I can imagine that as well, about companies engaging in sort of that sort of maybe cynically PR work. I haven't thought it through, but I think, so what I'm trying to say is just insofar as, in the cases where privatization limits expressive content, where the state sets out to have the public space as a vehicle for communicating these values, that's when I would be skeptical of privatization. But that doesn't apply in your case, so maybe in that case there's something else to be said. Yeah, I don't see a huge problem with that. I think that would be nice, yeah. Thank you. And I think that ties in, with you in the green shirt as well. There's more that could be done in terms of explicit legislation, but I'm not sure to what extent that solves all of the maybe inherent tensions between property rights. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello, thank you to you both for these talks. They were great. My question is more for Anna, but I would like to hear, I think, both of your thoughts on this as well, and kind of think continuing with kind of the theme. So I'm very convinced by your argument against privatization. And I do tend to agree with you that limitations to ownership tend to be quite restrictive in what they can do. But I think what I would push you on then is, what do we do when the privatization has already occurred, when POPs already make the most of the publicly available space? So what I was thinking throughout this entire time was Oxford, and how this university owns most of the city and lots of the spaces here. So you have spaces that are accessible to non-students, you have some places that are only accessible to certain students or charge for admission, and kind of the town versus gown, and the town gets pushed out. And how you have kind of these tensions, because there's not a lot available other than the university-controlled spaces. And how these things are governed. So there was the big controversy, especially last year, with the Pitt Rivers encampment, for instance, when kind of the university removed encampment from kind of the land in front of the museum, and kind of talking about returning it to the public, like the protesters were removing it from the public and the university was returning it to public enjoyment. So how can we think about ways of improving governance, and when there's no question of just, let's have this be a property of everyone, let's have this be public property? I don't think in a city like this would be feasible or very easy at least, to just return this to kind of public ownership. So what can actually be done kind of to have democratic forms of governance in places that are already very privately owned?
And maybe Philippe? No.
Okay, for good balance, it's a question for Marta. So, well, I'm a fundamental city dweller, so I read the book on the City of Equals with special interest. But there is one question that puzzled me, and perhaps you'll be able to give an answer. And well, the question may bounce back to the authors. And I understand why a city of equals should be quite understood. I understand now why it should be understood quite differently from a nation of equals or a world of equals. But should it be understood differently from a village of equals? Mm-hmm. That is, of course, the field work will be quite different, perhaps healthier and safer than in cities, but wouldn't the basic ideas be essentially the same? Or do you expect, if they were ever to write a book on this, on a village of equals, do you think they'll come up with something very different?
Maybe start you. No, okay. It's a difficult, it's not an easy question. Yeah, I will start and then I'll pass on to Anna. Yeah, I mean, so both Jo and Avner actually make an argument why the city will be different than the nation state in the global arena. There's massive debate within the field whether actually the city itself is different, or maybe actually the locality itself is different, or whether the city encompasses something what would be particularly unique. In the paper I presented, we are kind of agnostic, both me and Carl. We kind of argue that both a city and a village could be sites of justice. So perhaps there could be a book about a village of equals, how it will look like, and some sort of form of organization. But of course, I'm not only devoted entirely, my own personal intuitions would be that the city is somehow different than the village. There's much more scale, much more diversity, much more movement dynamics. Cities are much more complex. And I think the complexity, I also work on complexity, the complexity precisely makes challenges some sort of the issues, like equality, justice, fairness, also democracy. Cities are also fascinating from the perspective of governance. There are so much, or management even, there are so many institutions over there which are overlapping. Some of them are private, some of them are public, some of them are, international organizations, etc. There's so much confusion as a result, and everything moves so quickly, even in terms of institutional design, that very often it's ungraspable for inhabitants, or it's difficult to grasp what's precisely within capacity or which organization. So I engaged with some interviews in London, and actually one of the problems in London, which is obviously a very big city, we have a lot of institutional design and there's a sort of complexity within. Actually, inhabitants have very little acknowledgement what sort of powers belong to which institution, and why, for example, issues that they are frustrated at the local level are not within the capacity of local governments. And very often, it's very rich and very complex. But obviously, there's also a lot of social, for example, complexity in rural areas, in which the connection and kind of personal issues goes back and forth in generations, but there's not so much institutional dynamism and complexity as it is in the cities. So actually, I'm my sentiment would be to argue that the cities are actually quite different than villages, which doesn't mean that there shouldn't be also a village of equals. I'm waiting for this book to happen. I know the first question was slightly more to Anna, but I still want to it was praised as both, so I'll respond. Actually, that's a great question, and of course, I think also in UK, actually a lot of properties and a lot of land is actually owned by a royal family, which I think, and maybe the North Part Church, etc. So actually, very much in the land of lack of private property, or a lot of
private, but not a lot of public property. So actually from kind of my democratic sentiments, I would like to see much more diversification. So I don't think maybe necessarily all of them are bad or that they shouldn't exist at all, but maybe we should have more church spaces. Maybe we should have some sort of exclusive spaces as well. So essentially kind of the value would be in diversity, in which different groups of people could find their own belonging, with some sort of necessity of some really open true public spaces that are welcoming for all. That would be kind of my vision for that. And I'll pass on to Anna.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. I think that there are many people who come up with very sensible suggestions on how to increase the public character of POPs. So there's, some of the things that Cecilia mentioned, but you can, things like access rights, things like the sort of activities that are permitted and so on. But I think maybe especially important are sort of transparency rules around rulemaking itself. So how are the rules that govern a space formulated? Is there an input process by the public? Do they have to be made public? So there's a lot of that, I think, that would be very helpful to increase the public character of privately owned public spaces.
So last question.
Online question.
Well, I cannot see.
Meantime, maybe this.
Can I just continue the question from Philippe? Because I think so village of equals, is that going to be like something visible? And I think his question is related to the kind of a distinction we can have about principles and the application of the principles. So at the level of national level and the city level, are the principles the same, or what change is the application of the principles?
Yeah, we are kind of agnostic in that, so I don't really necessarily know. So in terms of the locality, I think the kind of value of engaging with locality, both the cities and also villages, that they come with certain specific context. So I don't necessarily think that there would be one universal theory of justice for all the cities, just the city of equals. Even in Jo and Avner's work, it's actually very much open for context. So this Elster work on local justice, in which he kind of applies, for example, theories of justice not only to different contexts, but also different spheres of life, essentially. And with this, I'm very sympathetic. I think context is essential. It's actually not a village in principle. I think it would be very difficult to have a city of village as a kind of or kind of general city of village. I think the context here of particular villages would be very important. And to some extent, I also think interest in cities invites this context. That's the reason I find it so vulnerable. Provides much more richness to the theory.
Okay, thank you. So it's a long question to Anna. So maybe you want to...
Katharina, I can ask it, and everyone can it will be more comfortable for you. So this is from Pilar from online. Thank you for all the online audience that I ignored in the beginning, so thank you for joining us. So this is a question for Anna. Have you considered adopting a more deontological approach which would avoid some of the problems brought up in the Q&A? I'm thinking of Sandel's view that something should not be for sale, and Sat's view of noxious markets. Maybe what is wrong with POPs is that they put a monetary value to something that should not be for sale. So institutions are acting wrongly by doing this regardless of any positive consequences.
Sorry, let me just read a little bit. Oh, it's the first one, not yeah. They're doing this regardless of any consequence. Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's a buy-in in the question. So maybe what is wrong with POPs is that they put a monetary value to something that shouldn't be for sale. Why? And I feel like my argument is kind of the answer to why, if that makes sense. Why it shouldn't, you shouldn't put you shouldn't put it for sale. Why? Because in what I'm trying to say is that it changes the expressive meaning of that act. Yeah, I think that's. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the idea that that something feels off about putting it for sale, but I guess what I ask myself is what exactly is it that makes it feel off? And I think maybe there's other things that I'm sure there's many other things that can be said, but I guess the way I thought is in this is really that one small puzzle with the expressive value. And then, of course, I suppose you can flesh it also out with in terms of the loss of connection, protest, and disruption. So maybe these things work well together. I think that's how I understand the question.
Okay, thank you so much. And now we have the lunch outside, right?
Let's first applaud. We'll be